Howdy y'all. Namaste and welcome back to this religious quest. Or maybe I should say welcome aboard. That's the title of this little talk today, this little mini lecture or whatever. Welcome aboard. We're still in the sort of our pre-departure stage of this religious quest. Before you go on a quest or voyage with somebody, you want to know a little bit about the captain, right? Who is this guy? What's going on here? You need to question their motivations, question their credentials, question their lived experiences, that sort of thing, right? So who is
what are
this
person's
person?
motivations?
What are their motivations?
What makes them do
what
what they
are
do?
their credentials?
What are their
lived
credentials?
experience?
But also,
lived experience?
credentials are great and all that, but what about a person's lived experiences, right? What kind of experiences have shaped them into the person that they are?
So I want to address some of that today, right? Answer some of those questions because we need a healthy dose of skepticism, right? And especially in this world, you're not sure who to trust, you're not sure where to get information. There's a lot of people out there talking. Who should you listen to and why? Only you can answer that question, right? But it's my job to tell you a little bit about myself. Also, one of my favorite times of the semester is this beginning. As a pedagogical practice I've been doing for years, one of the first things that I do is I meet individually with each and every student at the beginning of the semester. This semester I'm teaching 7 courses. I have 123 students, and so this is the time where I meet individually and get to know all of these people, right? Find out what makes you tick, why are you here, that sort of thing. Find out a little bit about you, and you want to know a little bit about me too, right? Who is the captain of the ship or whatever. So I want to address those things today. First one is motivations. Why am I doing this? I mean, why am I doing this? I mean, on the one hand, I'm getting paid to teach this course at Fitchburg State, and it's an online course, so I got to record videos and share videos and that sort of thing. But why do it on YouTube, and why make it public, and why share it in this way? And, there's a lot of risk involved in that, everybody can see it, right? That's what public means. It's out in the public square. It's out in the marketplace, like Socrates and those kind of things, like putting it out there for a whole world to see. My exes can see it, and my old professors could see it. My future potential employers can see it, right? Everybody can see it. So that's scary, right? Anxiety producing. What would motivate me to do something like this? Believe me, I have motivations. In fact, I think about that question a lot. Why would I do this? Why am I doing this? I gave you a couple of insights last time in that sort of preface video, right? I mean, we live in a world in 2022 that is, it's filled with a lot of division, filled with a lot of talking, not so much listening, right? Not so much valuing people's diversity. We live in a world where we are losing a lot of freedoms on the daily, and diversity seems more and more devalued on an ecological level, on a social level, on pretty much every level, right? So that's part of why I'm doing this, right? Is because these are things that I know a little bit about and things that I've been studying and thinking about for a long time, and because I feel like our world does need some semblance of healing, some way to understand diversity and the value of freedom and diversity and how the relationship between those kind of things. So part of my motivations is that. Another way of saying it, maybe this is another answer, maybe it's a different version of the same answer, is that trickle down education is not working, right? We live in a society where all these super educated ivory tower people are up in their ivory towers having all these really cool conversations, with one another, and educating one another, but it's not trickling down to the masses. It's not trickling down to, Joe Sixpack or however you want to say it. It's not trickling down, right? So we need education at the base level. I mean, we need everybody. We need this education, these thoughts, these ideas to be out there for everyone. We need it to not trickle down, but get to everyone, right? So I don't know. I guess I feel like we need sort of highly educated. We need a lot of people who are willing to put themselves out there and sort of spread some of their expertise and their knowledge and their scholarship with as many people as possible. And it's difficult to do it in a way that is accessible, and I'm still figuring that out. We're all still figuring that out, but the need is there. And without it, I think that this democratic experiment could fail, right? So I guess that's kind of another motivation of mine, is that democracy really needs dialogue. We need to learn how to listen to one another and how to learn from one another, how to value differences and those sorts of things. So it's important to me that my kids grow up in a world where, where they can be free and practice democracy in a society that values freedom and diversity. And recognizing that you can't have one without the other, as I mentioned before, right? You can't have freedom without diversity. And diversity requires freedom. So that's part of why I do. I have some other motivations too, but those, hopefully those are solid enough to get us started so we can move in to that next stage, like credentials, right? There's that word, credo. In Latin, credo, which is where we get the word credentials, or in Greek, pistos means faith. So what gives us, so there's a relationship between knowledge and faith, right? How do we know, or how can we trust what we know, right? Sometimes we know something, then we find out later it's not true. That's happened to me a lot in my life, right? Especially in regards to religion and what I've learned about other people's religions and what I've learned about my own religion and all sorts of things, right? So how do we have some sort of faith in what we know? And one of the answers to that is credentials, right? So we look at people who have certain credentials, and if you have certain credentials, then people have a certain amount of credence, they give credence to what you say, and they have a certain amount of faith or trust. That's what the word credo means, right? Creed, what you believe and where you put your faith and your trust. When you don't know somebody, then what you want to know is, can I trust what you say? And the first sort of avenue of that is credentials. So, I should tell you, what are my credentials, right? Obviously, Fitchburg State has vetted me and hired me, as has Boston College and Stonehill College and Anna Maria College. So I've been vetted by them, but you need to know, right? What are my credentials? So what are my credentials? Maybe the most obvious credential, a little bit of a flex, but, well, it's a pretty big flex. Yeah, so I have a doctorate from Harvard, right? Doctorate degree from Harvard. Spent 7 years at Harvard getting that doctorate. Usually takes 8.4 years. That's the average for a doctorate in the humanities from Harvard. I did it in 7. Did my doctorate from Harvard in comparative theology. Graduated with a degree, doctorate in theology in 2015. Started in 2008, finished in 2015, and wrote my dissertation on these guys, Nicholas of Cusa and Adi Shankaracharya. So it was comparative theology, Hindu theology, and Christian theology. But before that, I did a master's degree. Before my dissertation, which was 324 pages long, I did a master's degree in comparative philosophy from Dhammaram Vijayakshetram, which is a pontifical university. I got a license from the Vatican to teach philosophy and ethics. And my master's thesis there was called Autonomy, which is the name of my YouTube channel. Autonomy, the eco-archaeological ethics of comparative Advaitic philosophy. And before that, so 7 years for my doctorate at Harvard, 2 years at Dhammaram Vijayakshetram. By the way, that was in Bangalore, India. Before that, I did a 3-year Master's of Divinity at Drew Theological School in Madison, New Jersey. And before that, I worked in finance for a few years. And before that, I did my undergraduate degree, double majoring in music and finance. I can read Greek. I can read the New Testament, the Greek New Testament in Greek. I can read the Torah or the Tanakh in Hebrew. I can read the Bhagavad Gita in Bhashya and the Upanishads in Sanskrit. I can read Jacques Derrida is up there somewhere. I can read Derrida in French. I don't really understand him in English or in French, but I do my best. I can read Heidegger in German. I wrote a book, by the way, during my second master's. I wrote this book, The Quest for Postmodern Ethics, a phenomenological comparison of Martin Heidegger and Sri Aurobindo Ghosh, primarily focused on these books. Sri Aurobindo's The Life Divine, which in this printing is 1,008 pages long, and 2 books by Martin Heidegger, Being in Time and Beiträge vom Philosophie, Contributions to Philosophy from Inowning. So, all told, I have 16 years of college education, mostly focused on religion, theology, and philosophy. But even my philosophical studies is focused largely on religious philosophy. And so 16 years of college, 4 degrees, 3 graduate degrees and 1 undergraduate degree, and 7 years in counting as a college professor, having taught at Boston College for 3 years, and Stonehill College for a year, and Anna Maria College in my second year there, and now in my 7th year at Fitchburg State University. These, just reading here, these are my credentials, but it does not mean that you will take credence or faith or trust in what I teach, right? Not everybody trusts that ivory tower, those kind of degrees, and some people will. Some people have a lot of respect for that sort of formal education and that sort of thing, and some people are like, oh, that's some people won't. Right? Some people won't. For some other folks, it matters what kind of lived experiences you've had, right? Have you seen the world? What experiences have you had, right? Wisdom comes not from reading books, although some of it does, but wisdom also comes largely from experience, right? So what kind of lived experiences have I had in the world, and what's my relation? Why study religion, right? What has my motivation been, not just to teach this on YouTube or to teach this in a class, right? But what's my motivation at all to even study religion, to study theology, to study God and the scriptures from all these traditions? So that's a good question. Let's dig into that, right? What sort of lived experiences have I had? Is it recording? So, we all need to be skeptical, right? Skeptical of whatever's around us. And that skepticism is good and healthy, right? We need to ask questions, like, what are this person's motivations? What makes them do what they do? What are their credentials? But also, credentials are great and all that, but what about a person's lived experiences, right? What kind of experiences have shaped them into the person that they are? And those are important questions for sure. And so I want to answer and address some of those questions. I think the first thing I want to do at this point is state clearly that I am a Christian. I identify as a Christian. I have self-identified as a Christian for my entire life. Since I was young, very young. I was the kid. I used to go and wake up my parents and say, "Hey, we gotta move on Sunday morning, or we're gonna be late for Bible study." That kind of stuff. My older sisters, used to call me LBJ, little baby Jesus, because when I was like in 6th grade, actually, um, pretentious little LBJ. I just had this desire to become a pastor. That's when I decided I really wanted to be a pastor, and I didn't want to wait. So in 6th grade, I was like, Ma, I gotta save these kids now. So I would get up early and go to school early, and decided that I was going to start preaching sermons on the baseball field. Told everybody, I'm preaching a sermon on the baseball field. If you want to do Bible study, and hear sermon, then come to the baseball field 6 o'clock, whatever it was before school. I didn't do that very long because nobody came, and why would anybody come anyway? When I was 10, right around 10 years old, right around my 10th birthday, I decided that I wanted to become baptized, and it was this whole big thing because I was raised Southern Baptist in upstate South Carolina, and at that time in that church, in that community, they didn't typically baptize kids that young, right? It was considered too young before the age of discernment, especially before puberty. You just didn't, it was considered before the age of discernment. So you weren't old enough to know what you're talking about. So I had to go through this whole process of discernment, meeting with the pastor and meeting with, all these people and everything. And but through all that process, which was good, it took a few months, but they were like, we don't see any reason not to baptize Brad. So I got baptized. It was a big deal for me, a big deal for my family and all that kind of stuff. That happened on a Sunday evening. And the next day, Monday, I went over to my best friend's house. My best friend lived right around the neighborhood, right around the corner in the neighborhood. And it was the only other kid our age, really, around the neighborhood. I went over to his house for dinner, did that a lot, right? Nothing unusual about that. And I was super excited to talk about my baptism and my experiences and all this kind of stuff. It was a big deal. And they were excited to hear about it. And they were like, we really want you to tell us. They said, so we're going to sit down at dinner. You can tell us all about it while we eat. And they said, but first, let's start by saying a prayer.
right? Start a meal by saying grace. And so we all closed our eyes, and his mom began saying the prayer, and she chanted this raga in Sanskrit. And at the time, I had been to their house plenty, and we said grace. And I just thought that was like a cool way to say grace or whatever, just singing and chanting and all that kind of stuff. And I didn't understand the words. But it was the first time that it kind of dawned on me that I really recognized and understood that they had a different religious tradition than my own, right? They were Hindu, and they were devout Hindu, and they understood themselves as being devout Hindu, right? And they were eager to hear my story of my baptism, which I thought was cool. In fact, they were more interested in it than most of my friends or most of my family. They were super interested in it. They really genuinely wanted to hear all about it. And they were asking lots of questions and all this kind of stuff. And after they asked all those questions and listened to me tell about my baptism, my rebirth, that baptism being born unto death and then rise again anew. This no longer I, but Christ who lives in me, and that Paul stuff. No longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Being born again. That was the kind of language that we used. And after all of that, I started asking them questions. And Judith was my best friend at the time, and Judith said, "Well, actually, I just went through this Upanayana ceremony." Because we were, both 10 years old, and he just went through this Upanayana, and I was like, "What is that?" And he said, "Well, it's a process of being born again, becoming a Dvija, becoming a second born, right? It's a second birth. It's a spiritual birth, right? You're born into this body, but then you begin this path of brahmacharya. You begin this path of what I understood to be very similar to discipleship, where you're learning your tradition, you're learning the scriptures, you're learning how to be a good person, you're learning how to become an ethical, moral adult, right? And take care of yourself and take care of those around you and learn how to be a good person, right? And it's called the Upanayana ceremony. You get this sacred thread, and which is representing your involvement in sacrifice, right? Sacrificing things for the benefit of others, and sacrificing a little bit of sacrificing your own pleasure for the benefit of those around you, right? Those sort of things that Jesus also stood for, right? And I don't know, just the language of it, the talking about the Dvija and the being born again and the death and baptism and this all, it's just so much of it was so similar, and it was really, I just found it really cool, and I found it cool how devoted he was, and he found it cool how devoted I was, and there was no concern about like, hey, come to temple with me, although they did invite me to temple, and I really wanted to go, just out of curiosity, right? And I invited them to church, and he really wanted to go. It just never happened. I think we're both a little bit nervous about it, and maybe family's a little bit nervous about it too. Um, but so that was one of my earliest lived experiences with religious diversity. And I was fortunate enough to have a number of those growing up. So unfortunately, Judith moved away. His family moved to Chicago. And I became friends with another kid. His name was Preston. And Preston, it turned out, was from the Philippines and was Buddhist. And his dad was Buddhist, and his dad had served in the military. He wasn't very devout. Neither of them were, or maybe he was nervous about talking about it or whatever. But I just also found that cool. And then when I got to middle school, to junior high, my best friend there was always kind of drawn, I guess, to people who were a little bit different. And I was fortunate enough to grow up in a place that had a lot of diversity. And my best friend in junior high was this kid. His last name was Chowdhury. Chowdhury. But now I know, the history of that name and that kind of stuff, and being from the Mughal dynasty in India, and his family was from northern India and Pakistan, that region. And at the time, I didn't know much about Muslims, or I didn't really know anything about Muslims. I wouldn't really know what a Muslim was, I don't think, in junior high. And definitely he was the only one that I knew. And so my first experience with a Muslim was a Muslim from India. And turns out that a lot of folks, especially in the United States, tend to associate Islam and Muslims with the Middle East, but only 20% of Muslims are from the Middle East, right? 80% are all over the world, especially in other parts of Asia. And so he again, he and his family were devout, and it's hard to be devout Muslim, in upstate South Carolina a little bit. In high school, then I had another friend, Rothchek. He and I were best friends. We were like in quartet together and band together and all that kind of stuff. And he was Cambodian Buddhist, and we used to talk about that. His family also was very very devout in their practices and everything. So I don't know, I just always had these experiences with people from lots of different religious traditions, and I was and continued to stay very grounded and rooted in my own religious tradition and my own religious understanding, always going to church and super interested in the Bible. Sometimes the sermons went a little far afield, and would just sit there and read my Bible. I was more interested in the Bible a lot of times than in a lot of the other stuff that was going on. But I also got very into music and participated in the church through that. I went off to college, and I met these guys, the chaplains, the two Baptist chaplains at Furman University, which was founded by Richard Furman, who founded the Southern Baptist Convention, so like the most Baptist, super Baptist school. And I fell in with the Baptist chaplains there. And at the time there was a lot of fervor in Greenville, South Carolina, over homosexuality, and they passed this resolution basically saying that gay people were not welcome in the community. And the chaplains wrote a response to that from a Christian perspective, and saying, we need to love our neighbor, we need to see one another as Christ would, and see one another as an irreducibly unique image of God. That's my language, not theirs, but my language comes from the kind of understanding of what does it mean to be a unique image of God, largely, from mentors like the chaplains at Furman. They pulled me into this program called CRV, Church-Related Vocations. And basically CRV is people who had some sort of interest in going into church-related vocations after college and that sort of thing. But what it really meant is that we had a meeting once a week, and we planned out the upcoming church service, and we divided up like who's going to do the reading, who's going to lead this prayer, who's going to do this or that invocation or benediction, and those sort of things. And then together let us heroically use this knowledge and wisdom to transform the world around us. Together, right, together we led the worship service, and then one of the chaplains would give the sermon. Usually we did actually take turns. Each one of us would give like one sermon a year if we wanted to, which I always did. Also, while I was at Furman, I went on a pilgrimage with one of the chaplains. We went on a pilgrimage, began in Egypt, and sort of following the path of Moses out of Egypt and up through Sinai, and we climbed Mount Sinai before the break of dawn, so that we were at the top of the mountain when the sunrise came up, and I had one of several religious experiences in my life on that day, which was very profound and moving and that sort of thing. Then we went to the Holy Land. We went to Israel and Jordan and Palestine. Then we went to Rome and the Vatican and all this kind of stuff. It was a really cool sort of pilgrimage and trip, academic trip, but also spiritual pilgrimage for me. So then I got married, moved to New York City, went into a career in finance, and wound up getting a job at Morgan Stanley Dean Witter on the 73rd floor of Tower 2 of the... That's my microphone. So went up. So I got a job at Morgan Stanley Dean Witter on 73rd floor, Tower 2 of the World Trade Center. This was in 1997, which is when I graduated from college, and moved on. Became associate vice president at Thompson Institutional Services by the time I was 24. Things went really well, and things were good in finance. But then September 11th, 2001 happened. And at the time, in addition to working in finance, I was also very involved in my church, West End Collegiate Church in New York City, and working, with the youth as a youth director, youth pastor, and also running the soup kitchen there, which was really a lived experience for sure. And gave me a new perspective on life and all sorts of things. We used to do this Bible study. Anybody who wanted to come to the Bible study was free. They could definitely go to the soup kitchen even wasn't like a requirement or something, right? But anybody who wanted to participate in the Bible study could. And at the beginning I was like all nervous, like I don't know, what I'm going to talk about and that kind of stuff. But quickly realized that they all had plenty to contribute, right? Everybody, we were learning from one another. Where two or three are gathered, there also will I be, said Jesus at one point. And so we were learning together in this big circle, right? With the Bible at the center, and so this great amount of diversity in backgrounds and diversity in gender, diversity in race, diversity in age, diversity, just so much diversity, right? Most of them were homeless. Some of them were not quite homeless or living in shelters or those sort of things. But it was really really powerful experience. Definitely had an impact on how I understand the podcast assignment that I use now in all of my classes, including this one. So having those meaningful discussions with one another, learning from one another, listening to one another, having meaningful dialogue and discourse across all sorts of boundaries, and founding a real connection to one another through discourse and dialogue. So that was kind of cool. Then September 11th happened, and I decided to reevaluate my life and my relationship, and I just didn't want to live in New York and all sorts of things. And so I decided to go to seminary. So I went to Drew Theological Seminary in Madison, New Jersey. And I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do, whether I wanted to pursue ordination. I did wind up pursuing ordination, became Congregationalist, which is not all that different than Baptist, still non-doctrinal, Congregationalist, bottom-up, spirit, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so yeah, I guess I'm kind of rambling on, and so many stories to tell about lived experience, the experiences that I've lived over the past 47 years and counting, right? And a little bit more to say, but the school bus is here, and my son is home from school. I was hoping to have this done before then, but it didn't happen. So anyway, I'm gonna have to pause here and I guess continue later. Back now. Yeah, so anyway, seminary was a trip, man. I mean, just super intense Bible study, totally changed how I look and understood, Jesus and the religious tradition which I'd been a part of my whole life, and understood it at totally new levels, and understood discipleship and apostleship and duties and responsibilities, but also studied interfaith dialogue and interfaith religious studies very intensely there with Wesley Aryaraja, one of the world experts on that topic. When I was interning at a church, First Congregational Church of Montclair, that's where I really started to learn Teze and different meditation practices. Wonderful experiences there. Did lots of traveling. Went to Ghana, which is where I got things like this, and went to India for the first time. With Wesley, and went to Brazil and participated in the World Council of Churches. Then I moved to India. In India, I studied, as I mentioned, at Dharmaram Vijayakshetram for my formal education and got my master's in comparative philosophy there, as I already mentioned in the credentials section, right? But on the lived experiences, then I got this mentor, Suresh Sharma, and lived with his family. Not lived with his family, but his family welcomed me into their own, and we got to be very close. Not only teaching me Sanskrit, but teaching me Sanskrit in a very traditional sort of way. He was educated at the Sringeri Mata and Sringeri, Karnataka. I know it doesn't mean anything to most of you, but it's a very traditional way of learning. And so, studying in this traditional way was very cool. And so, it's always hard to know how to end one of these things. And as I was just thinking, all these different identities, right? So my motivations for putting this on YouTube, my motivations for teaching in general, and my credentials, my academic credentials, right? And those lived experiences and the story of my life, something to kind of try and tie all of these things together. And I was thinking about this. He's a theologian, he's a philosopher, he also has a doctorate in chemistry, so he's a scientist too. But his name is Raymond Panikkar, and on all those books on my shelf, I got a whole bunch of books by Raymond Panikkar up there. I didn't want to record in there because my son's in there on the computer, trying to respect his space and not take over his space either. But this guy, Raymond Panikkar, he described his life early in his life. He described his life as sort of this journey, this quest, right? This religious quest, not unlike this one. But him understanding his life as this religious quest. He was born in Spain, Spanish mother, and an Indian father who escaped India, who had to flee India under British rule because he wanted freedom. He was a freedom fighter, like Aurobindo, who also had to flee from the British, or Gandhi, who had to flee didn't flee from the British, but spent most of his life in jail as a result. Panikkar was born in Spain and raised in Spain, but then later in his life, after India was free, then he went to India, and he described his journey to India in this way, right? In this literal way, but also this very beautiful, metaphorical, spiritual quest, the spiritual journey, where he says, I left Spain, I left a Christian, found myself to be Hindu, and returned a Buddhist, without ever having ceased to be Christian, right? So he left a Christian, stayed a Christian his whole life, right? But found himself to be Hindu and found himself to be Buddhist, right? And practiced and understood these things in a way that didn't contradict one another, and in fact is a way that sort of enriched one another in this diversity of thinking, this diversity of practice, this lived experience that was also grounded in the scriptural traditions and also grounded in philosophy and logic and also grounded in ontology and all these other things that... So Panikkar is this very fascinating figure and thinker, one of the greatest thinkers that I've ever read. And certainly has an impact on why I've designed this course the way I have and why I understand this as a kind of quest, right? A quest where we begin to discover ourselves by discovering things that are different, and which helps us to understand ourselves differently, right? And so here, calling this lecture, or this video, whatever you want to call it, I'm calling it Welcome Aboard, right? As we're getting to know each other, as I'm getting to know you through our meetings together, and you're getting to know me through this, discussion about my credentials and my lived experiences and my thoughts and that sort of thing, right? We're just kind of boarding this this vessel, this ship, if you will, together as we embark on this religious quest. And so now it's time to shift away from all this pre-departure stuff, right? And then actually move into our philosophical quest and start getting some of the tools that we need in order to do that. And so the next, but we have one more tool that we have to get, which is the phenomenological method. I'm not going to do that in this video, of course, but as soon as I find time and space between parenting and editing. So I'll have to find a time to record or recycle some old recordings on phenomenology and understanding what phenomenological discourse is, because that's really the method that we're going to be using, the method of inquiry that I use in all of my classes, and the way that method that we'll be using certainly in this philosophical quest, but also especially using in your discussions, in your podcast discussions with one another, as you practice the phenomenological discourse, the sitting around a circle, right, and having conversations with one another to discover your differences and to discover yourself in and through those conversations with other people who think differently or share differing perspectives, because they're different people and they have different backgrounds and they see the world from a different place, right? Which is maybe one way we can think about, or the way I think about, what it means to be in the image of God. I feel like this is all over the place. But what I strive to do in farming, what I strive to do in fathering, what I strive to do in teaching is to help my kids and the life around me, the ecology here, and my students for sure, to discover ways to develop and to become the best versions of themselves possible, right? And the way to become the best version of yourself possible is to begin to regard that unique aspect, whatever makes you different than everybody else, that uniqueness that I strive to get to know when we meet, which is why I meet with each one of my students at the beginning, to begin to see that which makes you unique, that which makes you irreducibly particular, as that pretentious Harvard version of Brad would say. Whatever makes you, you, right? That no one else is. Perhaps that is precisely the way that you are in the image of God, right? The infinite God could only be imaged through an infinite number of images that are each unique, right? Which each reflect a different aspect of the divine. And if we can begin to see ourselves in that way, right, as what makes me different and unique and totally unprecedented, right, irreducibly particular image of God, is precisely what makes me in the image of God, or revelation of the divine, which then we can begin to understand the value of diversity, the value of difference, the value of uniqueness, and of course, the value of freedom in a new way, right?
Freedom and diversity are two sides of the same coin.
You can't have one without the other because they're
Mutually
mutually
constitutive
correlates.
You can't have one without the other. You can't have freedom without diversity. And diversity requires freedom. Diversity is an indication of freedom, right?
Right, and then we begin to understand freedom as a value not only for society, but freedom as sort of a sacred value, as a religious value that a lot of people have. And through this religious diversity and understanding the diversity around us, then we begin to understand ourselves better and what makes us unique better and begin to understand that not only as something that makes us different, but something that makes us divine, or the spark of the divine. I hope this has given you some insights into what my motivations are, why I'm doing what I do, and also some of the credentials that I have, and hopefully give you some level of pistos or credo or credence or faith or trust in what I'm trying to do. And if not, then hit stop and move on. But if it is, then you could leave a comment, or you could let me know. Yeah, you could let me know. Word. Peace out. Namaste. Goodbye.